Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hi. Thanks for everyone for being with us here. There's still some lively chat going on, discussion going on in the chat box. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. Regret we had a few moments of technical difficulties, so we're getting a little bit of a late start. But once again, welcome to everyone, and thanks for being with us. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. Today we have a guest, our speaker, Vivian Valencia. She'll talk about some of her work. The presentation will review some recent research on patterns of tree species diversity and community composition in coffee agroforestry systems and social drivers related to farmers' decision-making and ecological processes giving rise to some of those patterns. Before we begin, maybe just mentioned that the Agroforestry in Action webinar series happens about monthly on Wednesdays, and we try to balance between both agroforestry in the United States as well as agroforestry topics internationally. Today's presentations will run about 40-45 minutes, after which we'll have some time for question and answers. Our speaker today, Dr. Vivian Valencia, is a postdoctoral research fellow in agroecology and food system sustainability at the University of Michigan. For her doctoral research, Vivian integrated methods and theories from both natural and social sciences to investigate how small farmers manage forests to produce shade coffee and also the consequences for biodiversity conservation. Excuse me. Vivian's research took her to the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, where farmers grow coffee inside of a biosphere reserve. She looked at patterns of tree species diversity, as I mentioned, and community composition in these coffee agroforests, and focused on trying to uncover some of the social drivers related to farmers' decision-making and ecological process. Vivian earned a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Columbia University. Recently completed a PhD, congratulations, and also a master's degree in environmental health from Johns Hopkins University, and a BS in biology and French from the University of Florida. So please, let's welcome our speaker, Vivian.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and I've already read a little bit about what some of the people in the audience are doing, very exciting work. I also see that there's someone from EcoSur in the audience, so that's very exciting. And yes, I'm very happy to be here and talk more about the work that I did while I was a PhD student. This is my doctoral work. And I'm mainly going to focus on two of the chapters of my dissertation, which are already published. And then I'll talk a little bit about the ongoing work that I have in this region of Chiapas, sort of following up after the coffee leaf rust epidemic. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about the motivation behind this work, why I'm interested, and I already read that some of you are also interested in tropical landscapes, so am I. And as we know, they contain the vast majority of terrestrial biodiversity on Earth. And this picture that I'm showing is a picture from my study site in Chiapas, and I think it's very representative of what tropical landscapes look like. A mosaic of different land uses, land covers, very patchy. You have natural areas, vegetated areas, patches of agriculture, all that in this very complex landscape. So this is the type of landscape where I work and the type of landscape that I'm, interested in working in and understanding these issues of biodiversity conservation and livelihoods. So some of the major challenges of these landscapes, as you all know, is to both meet these goals of conserving biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, but also sustaining rural livelihoods. So these landscapes contain the vast majority of biodiversity, but there are also people there. There are also communities there. We also need to think of people's livelihoods, and in most occasions, these livelihoods are connected to this biodiversity and this nature in this area. So we can't think of livelihoods as a separate thing and biodiversity conservation as a separate thing, because we won't be successful in an effort to conserve biodiversity. So I argue we need to think of this as two goals, as two sort of like a continuum. And some of the major challenges of tropical landscapes, so we need to also think about agriculture. So one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss in this region is agricultural expansion and intensification. So we can talk about conserving biodiversity and ecosystem functioning without talking about agriculture and the role that agriculture plays in this region of the world. And this map that I'm showing here, this is the biodiversity hotspot map, which highlights the 26 regions that we consider the 26 most important regions in terms of the biodiversity they contain, very high levels of species richness, endemic species that are only found in these regions. And out of these 26 or 20-something hotspots, at least 15 or 16 are in the tropics, which are the regions in red. And also, these regions overlap with areas of human poverty. So we have on one hand biological richness, and on the other hand economic poverty. So of course we cannot think of conservation without thinking of livelihoods and poverty alleviation, and trying to link the two. So how do we sustain rural livelihoods? How do we give a means for these communities to persist? And at the same time attempt to conserve this biodiversity, this last remaining forest, this endemic species in these regions. So thinking again about agriculture and integrating agricultural landscapes and biodiversity conservation, for a very long time we've focused on protected areas, and we drew from theories of island biogeography, and we conceptualized these protected areas, these remaining forest patches, as islands in an ocean of devastated land. And this devastated land, this ocean, was agriculture. And for a very long time, conservation efforts were placed on protected areas. But now we know that that's not enough. Most protected areas are too small. They're not well connected. They're just not sufficient. So we have acknowledged that most of biodiversity is going to have to persist in these highly human-dominated landscapes, where agriculture is one of the main activities that dominates these landscapes. And we talk about this as the matrix. And researchers here at the University of Michigan, such as John Vandermeer, Yvonne Perfecto, and many others, have contributed to thinking about the matrix differently and acknowledging that not all agriculture is the same. I mean, of course, there's monocultures with pesticides that are definitely not going to be a habitat for biodiversity and not necessarily allow migration from these forest patches. But there are types of agriculture that can complement these protected areas and can increase the permeability of the matrix, which is very important to increase connectivity so that these populations in these fragmented landscapes may subsist. So for that, we need to have these populations connected, being able to migrate. And a matrix that has some types of agriculture may complement these protected areas and allow for this migration, and may also be a habitat on itself. So going back to meeting these dual goals of conserving and supporting livelihoods, it's been suggested that agroforestry systems have this capacity of meeting both of these goals, supporting livelihoods because it's a form of agriculture where some crops such as coffee and cacao, which receive good market prices, can be cultivated, and at the same time, these agroforestry systems may be a habitat on themselves for biodiversity and also complement these protected areas. So this is part of why I was interested in focusing on agroforestry systems. Then I particularly chose to focus on coffee agroforestry systems because, well, as many of you may know, coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world after crude oil, which indicates it's very important economically. And during the years of my PhD, between 2010, 2015, coffee prices were increasing steadily. And also there's this niche specialty market for coffee that's also been growing tremendously. And we have more consumers, more and more consumers in the developed world, particularly in Europe, North America, that are willing to pay more for their coffee as long as they know this coffee was grown in environmentally friendly systems, in socially responsible ways. So we have more and more people interested in how their food is being produced and are looking for these labels and willing to pay more. And so is it true? Are you really helping conserve this forest? So for example, the coffee in green that says from the forest for the planet. That's Starbucks coffee from Chiapas, from the Biosphere Reserve of El Triunfo. And you can't read this, but on the side, there's a narrative that reads something like, when you buy this coffee, you're helping protect forests and support farmers' livelihoods. So there are a lot of narratives associated with this type of specialty coffee. And this type of specialty coffee, this bird-friendly, environmentally friendly, what are the other certification schemes? Well, etc., Rainforest Alliance, this type of coffee mostly comes from these agroforestry systems produced by small-scale farmers in regions like, Mexico, Central America, Africa as well. So I was curious to know, is it really doing what it's claiming to do? Is it really that environmentally friendly? Are we really conserving this forest? So that's what drew me specifically to coffee agroforestry systems. And going back to this biodiversity hotspot map, so here now biodiversity hotspots are in orange, yellow is coffee growing regions, and blue is cacao growing regions. You can see there's an overlap, which means that these coffee agroforestry systems are being grown in these biodiversity hotspots, which means it's even more urgent to understand if they're really contributing to conserving biodiversity in these areas or not, or what's happening. So I'm going to give you now a little bit more background specific to my research. So there's more than 20 years of literature on coffee agroforestry systems and whether they're a habitat or not. And this has been done for many taxa, for insects, for birds, small mammals, etc. There's also a lot of research on coffee agroforestry systems and their role as a buffer zone, as I mentioned earlier. I would argue that there's a bias, and most of this work has focused on fauna and to a lower extent on flora. But research on tree diversity in agroforestry systems has found that at the plot level, what ecologists call alpha diversity, that at the plot level, generally tree diversity is lower, when compared to forest, to nearby forest. But when we think of this ensemble of coffee farms and we think of the landscape level, what we find is that at the landscape level, these coffee agroforestry systems are capable of conserving comparable levels of richness as forest. And why is this? This is because there's a high heterogeneity, meaning from coffee farm to coffee farm, even though when you're looking at the plot level, diversity is low, because species are different, therefore there's heterogeneity. At the landscape level, that's where we're conserving more species, because of the heterogeneity from farm to farm. And there's, of course, been significant amount of work looking at tree diversity along a gradient of intensification from the shade monocultures, commercial polycultures, all the way to the rustic, more traditionally managed systems. And not surprisingly, this research has found that the more traditionally managed systems have higher levels of tree diversity. So my question, my overarching question was trying to understand this floristic pattern, these patterns of tree diversity and community composition between forest and agroforest, and try to understand what were the processes giving rise to these patterns, both from the social and the ecological perspectives. And this is the broad question. And this took me, as Gregor said, to the highlands of Mexico, of Chiapas. So Chiapas is that state in the southwest of Mexico, as you can see in the first map. And within Chiapas, I worked inside La Sepultura Biosphere Reserve. And within La Sepultura Biosphere Reserve, I focused on that region that's within this square. And La Sepultura Biosphere Reserve, there's more than 20,000 people that live inside the reserve. So the inner polygons are the core area, but the rest of the reserve, it's populated, 20,000 people in many small communities. And most of the people that live inside this reserve depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, primarily corn cultivation, bean cultivation, pasture land, and coffee as well. And I sampled 31 coffee farms, which are the black dots, and you can see the distribution, and 10 forest sites. And I worked in 2 different communities. And of course, my work was about trees, so I had to identify trees. So I worked very closely with a taxonomist from Ecosur, and I had a field assistant also aiding me in this work. And as I said, this is a biodiversity hotspot, which means there's high diversity. And even though my initial idea was that I would learn to identify these trees, I soon realized that that's just not feasible. So I worked very closely with Miguel to help me identify trees, and we identify both saplings and adult trees. in agroforest and forest. We also took other measurements like diameter at breast height to calculate basal area. I measured canopy openness with a densiometer, elevation, and farm location with a GPS unit. I also interviewed 50 farmers, and I asked questions about the trees they preferred in their agroforest and why, the trees they disliked and why, what were their selection criteria, what were the uses of some of these trees, also the sources of their knowledge. So their management practices, their preferences, where is this knowledge coming from? Is this knowledge that's being passed on, generation to generation? Is this things they're learning from their observations, experimentation, from workshops? Where is this knowledge coming from? I also collected data on farm characteristics such as how old the farm was, previous land use, meaning whether the farm was established on a forest without agricultural history, or on fallow, meaning land that had agricultural history, yield, and then certification. So most of the farmers, when I was doing my PhD work, most of these farmers were certified. And I say when I went, because after coffee leaf rose, there's been many changes, and I'll talk about that towards the end. But at that point, most of them were certified organic, and were in the process of obtaining certification. So this is my first chapter. So my first chapter, I wanted to ask the question, what is the role of coffee agroforestry in conserving tree diversity and community composition found in native forests? So basically comparing forest and agroforest, how were these coffee agroforests similar or different from forests, not only by looking at richness or diversity like most studies have done before, but also by looking at community composition. Because the problem with diversity indices and using richness and those type of metrics is that they reduce your diversity to a number. So you may have two plots with equal diversity, but they may have completely different community composition. So these metrics are hiding that information. So they're not telling you much about the identity of these trees, which is of course an important question, because it's not the same thing to have high diversity of pioneers than high diversity of a mixture of old growth, late successional trees. So I also compared forest agroforest by traits of succession. That means whether a tree is a pioneer, intermediate, or late succession, and also presence and abundance of tree species of conservation concern. And these are trees that had been labeled by the red list as being endangered. So what I found is similar to what I've already presented. So I found that at the plot level, alpha diversity, yes, coffee agroforests have significantly lower diversity than forest, not surprising. Also consistent with the other studies, I also found that when you look at the landscape level diversity, this ensemble of coffee agroforest is comparable to forest in terms of richness. And you can see that here. I use the Cowie index and species accumulation curve. So you can see these curves converging, which means that there's comparable richness between these two systems at the landscape level. But when I looked at community composition, I found a very different story. So this is an ordination. This is a non-metric multidimensional scaling. And what it does is, it's based on my community composition data. And what it does is it sort of reduces the complexity of the data and plots it in this 2D plot. And in red, the triangles are the coffee farms, and the black circles are the forests. So the closer 2 points are, the more similar they are in community composition. So as you can see here, the coffee farms are clustering. They're not really overlapping with the forest. And I perform analysis of similarities to see whether this difference was statistically significant or not, and it was. So community composition between these two systems are different. Then I looked at community composition by succession stage and conservation concerns. So if you focus first to the left on those bar graph, to the left is forest, to the right is the agroforest, and in orange is pioneer trees. And you can see that farms, over 70% of these trees on average are pioneer trees, whereas the natural occurrence of pioneer trees in the forest is only about 30% of trees. So you can see at this high proliferation of pioneers, and about half of those trees are Inga species. And in forest, that's about 10% only. So Inga trees are native to the region. They're nitrogen fixators. And as you will see later on, these are trees that farmers really like. Then to the right, I'm looking at these trees that are of conservation concern. And on average, this forest, 25% of the trees in this forest are of conservation concern. But that drops to only 10% when we're looking at the agroforest. So that's also significant. So what do we care about? So I showed you at the beginning that yes, in terms of richness, diversity, these two systems are sort of comparable. But when I showed you what's inside, I show you they're very different community compositions. So what do we care about, I guess, as society, as conservation biologists, as farmers? Do we just want to conserve high levels of richness just to conserve diversity, or do we care about the diversity we're conserving? Do we just want to conserve a diversity of pioneers, so we want to conserve the diversity that's actually found in the forest? So that's a question that we should ask ourselves. If we're okay just with comparable levels of richness, we're already doing it. But if we want to conserve what's in the forest, then we need to have a conversation. And also to conceptualize in a larger picture, like the larger picture, to place these findings in a larger picture. I think also when we're thinking about the conservation value of these systems, we also need to think of the other alternatives. What other things are happening in this landscape? So at the beginning, I told you that in this landscape, the alternative systems are corn, which is a monoculture with pesticides, pasture land, basically no trees or very few trees. So if agroforest is replacing forest, that's not ideal, because I show you they're very different. They're changing the community composition, not comparable. But if these agroforests are replacing these forms of conventional agriculture and they're an alternative for farmers, then that's where I see the value of agroforests as an alternative to these other detrimental forms of agriculture, but not as something that's replacing forest. That shouldn't be. So our policies, our incentives, certification schemes, whatever, should try to incentivize the agroforest being instead of conventional agriculture. So either replacing it as an alternative, but should disincentivize expansion of agroforests into forests. From an ecological standpoint, this is not what we would like to see. So moving on to the next part, and I want to, leave enough room for discussion. So the next part is where I focus more on knowledge and management. And where is this knowledge coming from? Are these agroforests that we're seeing, these differences in community composition, is this because farmers are driving that directly? Is this the direct effects of farmers' management? Or is this sort of like the unintended consequences of just management, opening the canopy to have more light reach the understory? So for all of you that may not be so familiar with these agroforestry systems, so farmers go the way they're established, farmers go into the forest, they have to remove some trees, of course, to make physical space for the coffee bushes, but also to open the canopy and have more light reach the understory, because coffee does need, it's shade coffee, but it still needs light. So there's all these disturbances, opening of the canopy, more light reaching the understory, which may cause changes in microclimate. There are soil disturbances related to weeding practices. So maybe these changes that I'm showing you is just the unintended side effects of these management practices, or is it the result of farmers' tree preferences and selection criteria? So that's sort of part of what I wanted to investigate here. And also, where is this knowledge coming from? Is this knowledge that's being passed on from generations, or are they learning this from workshops, or where is this knowledge coming from? So this is a busy slide, and I think it's a little bit cut off in the bottom, but it's not important. Well, it is a little bit important because it has the info. But anyways, so I want you to focus first on the bar graph. So the first two bar graphs, you can see in the bottom what they are, but I know what they are because it's my data. So on the left and the right, I'm comparing forest and farms. And the left is a forest, and the right is the agroforest. And how do I know this? Because in blue and green, is the preferred trees. So part of what I ask is what trees farmers prefer, which trees farmers dislike. So preferred trees are this set of trees that farmers repeated basically in all interviews, and it includes Inga trees, and it's about 8 trees. Not all of them are pioneers. And disliked trees are the trees that farmers systematically remove and dislike. Most of them are pine trees, oak trees, which is understandable because these trees have allelopathic effects, cause yellowing of the coffee bush, etc. So these are the trees that are systematically preferred and disliked, and this was sort of consistent across all my interviews. And then neutral trees, which is pretty much most of the trees, farmers don't have strong feelings against or in favor of. And these preferred trees, the reason why farmers prefer them is because of the type of shade. So some of their traits, you know, the type of shade is not very dense shade, the type of leaf litter they create. For example, in terms of Inga trees, farmers associate Inga trees with better soil quality. So those are the reasons why they're preferring these trees. So as you can see, the farms, on average, 60% of the trees in farms are preferred trees. So that's the green portion. When you compare it to the bar on the left, that's a much lower portion in forests. And of course, these disliked trees are, you know, greatly reduced. Those pine trees, oak trees, and the other disliked trees are reduced. As you can see, the red is much smaller in the farms. Then the last three bars, it's saplings. So forest saplings versus farm sapling before and after weeding. And what I'm showing is that basically after weeding, all these like trees are removed. Okay, so this is this coffee agroforest shown from the perspective of preferred and disliked trees. So when I got to the knowledge part and the farm management part, what I found is that in terms of management practices, most of these management practices, farmers are learning them from workshops. Tree-specific knowledge is a mixture of workshops, but also empirical knowledge, meaning based on their observations. And their knowledge on Inga species is also a mixture of these workshops and what they're observing. So these workshops are having, and workshops are NGOs and external agents that are going to these communities. A lot of these workshops were associated with the certification and maintaining certification. I'm going to move a little bit faster so that we have time for discussion. But so then let's see the next slide. So the next slide, so this is sort of like a second analysis that I did in this paper in which I wanted to understand this, going back to the pioneers. So this proliferation of pioneer trees, is this, as I said before, a result of indirect processes, canopy gaps, changes in microclimate, soil disturbances? Is this sort of like the unintended consequences of management? Or is this part of a direct process, part of farmers' tree preferences and selection criteria? And among the preferred trees, some are pioneers, like Inga trees, but not all of them are pioneers. So I wanted to understand, are we seeing this proliferation? Is it mostly due to farmers' preferences, or is it also sort of like a side effect? So to get at that, what I did is I looked at neutral trees. So if you look at the last two bars, that's in the middle graph is, you've already seen it, the middle graph is all trees in a farm, in an agroforest. About 70% of them are pioneers. Then to the right of that is only the neutral trees. So neutral trees are the trees that are not systematically managed. They're not systematically favored or disliked or removed. So if you compare these farm neutral trees, which are the trees that are arguably not managed, to the forest trees, that increase that you're seeing is the increase that I attribute to the indirect consequences of management. So even if farmers did not have any tree preferences, if farmers were not managing trees at all based on their species identity, we would still see an increase in pioneers. And that's what I'm showing here. And that any increase above that is what I would attribute. So then the difference between farm neutral and farm adult is what we can attribute to farmers' tree preferences and selection criteria. So this proliferation of pioneer trees to a larger extent is because farmers are favoring those trees. But even if farmers change their management practices and we're not favoring any tree or actively managing trees based on their species, we would still see an increase in pioneers as the part of the indirect consequences of management. So this is a little bit of a summary slide for this second part. And what I'm seeing here, so forest, agroforest, there's a divergence, a floristic divergence, as I've already shown. The forest and the agroforest are different in their community composition. And here I'm arguing that these differences are mainly driven by farmers' tree preferences and selection criteria, particularly the promotion of Inga trees. And this is a result of this external sources of knowledge, these workshops, but also their empirical knowledge, so their own perceptions. And to a lesser extent, but also important to mention, this divergence is an unintended consequence of management practices. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about Inga, because Inga is something that kept coming up during those 5-6 years of my PhD. And when I was asking farmers about their favorite trees, Inga tree was across the border the tree that farmers liked the most. And if you've done any research in coffee agroforestry systems in Mexico, Central America, you're going to find similar findings. So this is not particular to my study site. This is characteristic of, I would say, all the way from Mexico to South America. Farmers really like Inga trees in their coffee agroforestry systems. And why? So and also important to point out is I looked a little bit about the history of Inga. And Inga, as I said, is a native tree to this region. But so even before coffee arrived to Latin America, which coffee is not endemic to Latin America, even before that, Inga was already being used in cacao agroforestry systems. So it has a long history in the region. So I looked up, there aren't that many scientific articles about the effects of Ingas, at least not when I conducted this literature review. Maybe there's more research, I hope, that I have not overlooked. But the point is, when I was looking into this, I could only find really 2 studies that had really looked at the effect of Inga. So this article is pretty much what they did, this research is pretty much what they did, is they compared the Inga-dominated coffee farms with the more diverse coffee farms, and they did not find any significant differences in yields or soil characteristics. So I talk about this mismatch because this scientific knowledge, at least based on these 2 studies, is not really supporting this traditional local knowledge on the benefits of Inga that farmers spoke over and over again during interviews. Perhaps these studies are snapshots in time. So perhaps some of the benefits of Inga have to do with stability over time, or secondary products, or reduced weeds and pests. Also, another possible limitation of these studies is that they look at yields, per plot, and perhaps the effects of Inga are directly to the coffee bushes around it. So perhaps it does change soil characteristics, it increases yields, but perhaps it's just benefiting the coffee bushes directly around that particular tree. So if you average out across a farm, you may, those effects might be diluted. But anyway, so if any of you in the audience have more experience with Inga trees, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So another thing to think about, the living debt, extinction debt. So I showed you that, I went to these farms, as many other researchers have gone. I did a tree inventory. I found a certain level of diversity, whether it's pioneers or not. But the point is, the question to ask is, in the long term, are these populations viable? I showed you the sapling management. So pretty much all saplings are removed during weeding, and farmers select which saplings stay, and most of the time they're just favoring Inga trees. And part of their strategies are to replace the canopy by these preferred trees, and that's sort of their long-term strategy. And this is also things that came up during the interviews. So do these trees have a long-term future within these systems? Because these are long-lived species, it means some time may have to pass by before we see the effects. So that's the reference to the extinction debt. So that's another question to ask ourselves. We're going there and we're seeing this diversity and all that, but all these trees may be, as the living dead, and may not really have a reproductive future. So that's something else to think about, like the long-term implications for these trees in these systems. Finally, just as very quickly what I'm doing now. So I had some data for my PhD that I intended to use and I did not use. That happens. So I was also interested in understanding more about coffee expansion. So around that time, when I was doing my PhD, there were many claims that coffee agroforestry systems were expanding at the expenses of primary forests, and that if it weren't for coffee agroforests, many of these forests would have remained deforested because, due to elevation, topography, and other features, these forests were not suitable for other forms of agriculture like corn or pasture land, but they're suitable for coffee agroforests. So many of these articles were arguing that coffee agroforestry was sort of like a threat to this forest. And also, if you combine that with increasing coffee prices, increasing demand for specialty prices, of course, that's something to keep in mind. So I wanted to understand what was the role, if it was really that the case that most of these coffee agroforests were expanding at the expenses of forests, So that's part of why I asked farmers about the previous land use. So this pie chart that you see to the left, previous land use of current coffee farm, the farms that I interview, the farmers that I interview, 53% of those farms were indeed established in forests that had no agricultural history. But 41% of those farms were established on forests that had already been used for agriculture, that had an agricultural history, that at some point was a cornfield, most likely during the 80s, during the big corn boom in that region in Mexico. So, but this is showing that fallow is actually playing an important role. And at that time in 2012, I also asked farmers what were their expansion plans. And 70% of them said they wanted to expand, or they were going to expand their coffee farms. And as I said, coffee prices were increasing. It was, all the drivers were there, the incentives were there to want, for many farmers to want to expand. So then I asked them, where would you set this new coffee farm? So 48% of them said I would do it on forest. I have some more forested area in my property that I can use. But 40% of them said fallow land, so basically land that had already an agricultural history. So I thought this was very interesting because it was showing that fallow was playing an important role and that coffee agroforest could actually be an alternative to these other conventional systems and could go where these conventional systems had once occurred. But then I didn't do anything with this data, as it happens. But recently, 2013, we had this big coffee leaf rust epidemic in Central America, in Mexico, Latin America. And to date, it's a problem. So today, farmers are still struggling with coffee leaf rust. It's still a problem. They've tried many different strategies to try to cope with it, to eliminate it, but it's still there. So we wanted to understand, along my collaborators in Ecosur, Luis Garcia, who was in my committee, we wanted to understand how are farmers coping with coffee leaf rust and how these prior management practices and expansion plans have changed due to this external shock. So were farmers converting these farms to other forms of agriculture? Were they abandoning them? Were they removing shade? Were they trying different coffee varieties? What were they doing? So we went back and we interviewed the same set of farmers that I interviewed in 2012 and 2013. And these are very preliminary findings because I've only started to look over the interviews, so I haven't analyzed anything. But based on the original, me going through the interviews and all that, I can tell you that farmers are definitely not abandoning their farms or converting them into corn monocultures or pasture land or anything like that. Farmers are holding on to their farms because coffee is a very important source for their livelihoods. Corn cultivation pretty much is just for household consumption. It's not profitable. So coffee is really the source of income for many of these farmers, and they're not giving up that. They're going to wait for things to get better. Yields have definitely decreased. Some farmers have lost almost all of their coffee bushes to this disease. So of course that has serious livelihood implications. So different farms have been affected to different degrees, but they've all been affected some form or other. Farmers have already tried chemicals. So we asked farmers if they were still certified as organic. Some farmers don't know. The reality is that some farmers don't care because, and this is something we can talk more about during the discussion, because certification was not something that had a significant effect on their livelihoods. They were barely earning a little bit more than if they had been selling conventional coffee. So they're not that upset if their organic certification is lost. What they need is to maintain yields, to find a way to produce coffee. So some farmers have tried pesticides and things like that, which have not worked. So what farmers are doing now is that they're trying new varieties, in particular Oro Azteca and Costa Rica, which is a variety that has some Robusta in it. So as you know, Robusta is more resistant to coffee leaf rust, but also receives a lower market price, and its taste and quality is not comparable to Arabica. But it's more resistant to coffee leaf rust. So farmers are adopting these two varieties in various ways by replacing some of their dead coffee bushes, in putting them in between their Arabica coffee bushes that have survived, but also by creating new farms. So they're establishing new farms in what I think are lower elevations. And I say I think because I would have to go back, visit these farms, take some GPS points. So I need to follow up more on this. But based on these preliminary findings, it seems like this expansion is happening at lower elevations, which would be very interesting because this is not the typical way for Arabica expansion. Arabica expands, at higher elevations into forest, but in this case, it seems that it may be replacing more fallow land. So this is part of what we want to understand, but I think it's interesting because it has changed the possible direction of expansion from going to higher elevations to more forest to going to lower elevations. But this is something that we still need to follow up on. But we're very interested in following up on this work and learning more about how farmers cope with this type of shocks and how about their resilience, because I think these farmers are showing to be very resilient. They're not abandoning their farms. They're finding ways to cope with it. Oh, and that was the last slide. And so thank you very much. And we have 10 minutes to chat more. And I'd like to hear more from all of you. If you have questions, comments, or things you'd like to share from your own experience in your field site. So thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Vivian. Thanks for that presentation. I'm going to open up, as Vivian mentioned, we have some time for questions and answers. I'm going to open up a Q&A box here, and you'll see it there appearing on your screen. Hopefully, you'll see a question and answer box there. And if any questions, if you could please just, you'll see a dialog box at the bottom of that Q&A pod there, and if you could send in any of your questions, and hopefully can get a discussion going with Vivian. Maybe as we're waiting for some of those to come in, if you're having difficulty entering a question into the Q&A box, just let us know here, or you can use also the chat box. But I'm hoping that you should be able to use the Q&A box. Vivian, while we're waiting for a question, I'm just curious to know, can you comment on, say, we're looking at the conservation value of or impact of some of these coffee agroforests, and I'm wondering, can you comment on how the overall conservation value or impact is going to vary with its proximity, or the coffee agroforest, not only size, but proximity or adjacentness to protected forests or protected areas, or other types of land uses such as buffers or connecting biological corridors? I imagine that's going to influence its potential contribution.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and one that of course came up during my PhD, and that I was not able to address by collecting data. But yeah, I do recognize the effect of the landscape. What's your surrounding? Who are your neighbors? So it's not the same thing to be a coffee agroforest surrounded by forest that a coffee agroforest surrounded by pasture. So of course that's definitely going to have impacts on the diversity that I'm going to find within the coffee agroforest, because those trees that are existing in that coffee agroforest, they have to come somewhere, that seed bank. So of course the coffee agroforests that are surrounded by forest may have a higher diversity, or a diversity more similar to the forest, versus the ones that are more on the edge. So that's definitely something that would have an impact. I can't tell you how that would have impact, or how that impacted my results, because I did not collect that data. I did, however, looked at the effects of previous land use, and I did not show that here because it would have been too long. But if anyone's interested, that's like a separate chapter. And I did look at so as I said, some of these farms were established on forest, and some of these farms were established on fallow, meaning land with an agricultural history. And I did find that previous land use had an effect on the proportion of late successional species and pioneer trees. But that the most important thing, even when taking into account previous land use, still farmer preferences and promotion of Inga trees was even more important than the previous land use. And I can send a reference if someone's interested to look more into that. But yeah, previous land use, the landscape matrix, all those things, of course, have important implications.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess for promotion purposes, we're planning, and if there was efforts to actually promote adoption of coffee agroforestry with some conservation goals, in mind that perhaps best done in combination or, with some other strategies such as buffers or biodiversity corridors that would maximize some of the connectivity and species or genetic exchange. We see some questions coming in now, so let's try to address some of these questions here. Catherine Bukowski asks, out of curiosity, were farmers using the Inga species for anything else? Did they use the pods or the actual leaves for anything else, such as domestic animal feed or forage?
No, so the pods, so those are edible and farmers may eat them, but it's opportunistic. So they did really not care about the secondary uses of Inga, like timber or firewood or anything like that. Like, and also because these farms are very sort of remote, they're not by their houses. Some of these farms you have to hike hours, like some of these you have to hike 3 hours to get them. So it's difficult to exploit them for secondary products because they're not in close proximity to their houses. So they were interested in Inga primarily because they thought it was an excellent tree for their coffee. That's the primary reason.
Okay. Moving on, there's another question. Leslie Byrne asks, how old are the coffee bushes? The age of the coffee bushes in your study, and do they rotate or will they rotate with new farms? And if you can see the question there, Vivian, there's multiple parts to it. If you're able to read it, would you like to address some of Leslie's question?
Yeah. So how old are the bushes? Do they rotate or will they rotate with the new farms? So some of these farms, so this is, I didn't go into too many details, but some of these communities are actually fairly recently established. The older communities were established in the 60s. So some of these coffee farms are just 30, 40 years old. Do they rotate or will they rotate with new farms? So no, they don't. I mean, like, so once they establish the coffee farm, like the coffee, it takes like 3, 4 years before the coffee bush starts to be productive, and these are perennials, so they'll keep their farm there. Do they know what triggered the coffee leaf rust? So no, I think they blame a little bit a hurricane in 2013 for having, I guess, brought it in with the wind. But the sources, I don't know. Have they looked at building immunity?
Yeah, she asked about efforts to try to increase resistance, either in.
So that's what they're doing there. So what they're doing is with this new variety. So there's two types of coffee plants, Arabica and Robusta. And Robusta is resistant to coffee leaf rust. And these two varieties that they're using now in this area and in other regions in Latin America are hybrids with Robusta. So they're more resistant, but it's going to affect the quality of the beans. So farmers are worried about receiving a lower price or how much are they going to be paid. So there's this sort of like trade-off, right, between the qualities of Robusta being more resistant, can be cultivated at lower elevations, higher yields, but the compromise or the trade-off is that the quality is not comparable to Arabica, and this may and farmers don't know because it's going to take a few years before this before these plants start to produce. So farmers don't really know, and they're a little bit worried about that. That's why they're not letting go of their sick Arabica plants, because those are the ones that they know will receive good market prices, and they're worried about these new varieties and how much they're going to get paid for that coffee.
Thank you, Vivian. Moving down, if you notice the question from Sven Boss, he mentions having the pleasure of having met Luis Garcia Barrios in the past, but mentions his use of games in studying and trying to understand farmer decisions. Were you able to use any similar methods to explore farmer decision making?
Yeah, well, no, yeah, I've seen Luis work. Like he's been also collaborating with Yvette and John Vandermeer here, and like trying to find ways to use these games to understand, for example, coffee leaf rust. And I've played the games, the Aztec chess, and it's actually very interesting because it's complicated, the biological mechanisms. how like the interaction of all these different insects, and the game leads to better understanding, for farmers to better understand, and students and everyone. But no, I did not use them. I've seen them, and I'm very interested in that type of work, but I have not been able to use it, to try to use it to understand farmers' decisions or not. So yeah, I'm also familiar with his work, and it's very interesting, but I have not used it. So. And I also see that we did not read Alan's comment.
Please, yeah, go
So
ahead.
that so yeah, so Alan, I actually met Alan when I met you, Greg, in Delhi during the Agroforestry conference, and now he's a student of Luis and working in La Sepultura. And he's telling me here that it looks like many producers are interested in these rust-resistant varieties, and the government is promoting. Yeah, that's what we found in those interviews. And it seems that this is a strategy they're leaning for, because apparently other things have failed. They haven't been able to find pesticides or things to really control this. So they're going for these other varieties, which, like I'm saying, that's what we're trying to see now in this new study. Like, how is this going to change the landscape? Because these varieties mixed with Robusta have different requirements. So Robusta, for example, does not require as much shade as Arabica. So is this variety going to be grown with less shade, meaning less trees? Is this going to be grown at lower elevations? What does that mean? Is that a good thing ecologically? Because maybe some of these corn farms or areas with low tree density are going to have more trees to accommodate for these varieties. So I think coffee leaf rust now is going to have some consequences on the diversity in this area. And we don't know yet what those consequences are, with these new varieties and all that. And that's what we're trying to see in this follow-up work that I'm doing now with Luis.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions that have been submitted. Oh, here comes another question from Abrim Abdullahi. And he asks, he mentions coffee agroforests are known to increase land use intensity as farmers' management strategies keep increasing and having negative effect on natural forests. This question, are there methods or policies in place to improve the natural regenerative forest trees in your study area, despite the many money spending plantations' dominance on landscapes? Can you see Ibrahim's question, Vivian?
Yes. Yes, so to increase land use intensity. So yes, as I was saying, like the long-term goal within these farms is to replace the canopy by these preferred trees. And of course, so this is going to have, also how the saplings are managed. This has important consequences on regeneration. And as of now, with like policies or incentives within these coffee farms, I haven't seen any, for example, in the context of these certification schemes. About promoting regeneration or promoting. So these certification schemes are not doing that. They're not. They don't have that as some of their criteria. So and then regeneration within the forested areas. So at least in this region, there's a little bit of payment for ecosystem services. So there are some forests that definitely farm, and because it's also a protected area, farmers can't turn any forest into conventional forms of agriculture, but they can into coffee agroforests because they're still keeping the trees. So there's nothing in place to support regeneration or to look into regeneration. And I think we go into this forest, we do field inventories, we look at diversity, and we think, oh great, there's this level of diversity, this is great news. But when we look closely at regeneration, I think that's when it's a scary story, because these coffee agroforests are not regeneration is completely managed, and farmers are managing it based on their ideas and based on the coffee farm they want to see, which is a coffee farm dominated by Inga. So in the long term, if they continue this management, the idea is that this will become Inga monocultures.
One last question coming in from Leslie Byrne.
Yeah, and I think this had to be the last question because this room is reserved, and I think someone reserved it for one, and they're wanting me to leave. So, so sorry about that.
Well, she asked about the
so the
neutral
neutral
trees.
trees.
Please.
So that's my the way I label trees. So I label trees as preferred, disliked. Preferred were the trees that across the border farmers said those were the best trees to have, the trees they were systematically promoting. Disliked trees were the ones that were systematically removing. And neutral trees was everything else. And neutral trees are pretty much like 80% of the trees. So farmers were really concentrating a small group of trees as their preferred trees. And these light trees were just these pine, oak trees, and everything else is sort of like these neutral trees that they don't see as really good or really bad or really anything. Um, so yeah, so they're not managing against them, but by managing the preferred trees, they're replacing the neutral trees by preferred trees. So they'll be phased out too if this management practices continue.
Well, you probably would have observed management efforts to eliminate the undesirable trees, management efforts to promote the desirable trees, but would you have seen quite a diversity, a range of presence of some of the neutral trees depending on across the farmer and across different farms?
Sorry, they're asking me to
Okay.
leave now. I'm
Okay,
really,
well,
really
yeah,
sorry.
sorry about that,
Yeah, that's the problem. I don't know if you can hear them
well,
knocking.
thank you so much,
So,
Vivian. Yeah,
thank you very much. And if anyone wants to follow up or anything, please send me an email. And it was a pleasure being
great.
here. Okay. And thank you very much for everyone for
Thanks so much,
logging
Vivian.
in.
Yeah, you take
Thank
care.
you, Greg.
And
Okay.
thanks
Bye
to
bye.
all the participants for being with us today. Unfortunately, Vivian has to cut out as her space is reserved for someone else. So thanks so much. Let's see, can we see Vivian's contact information in case any of the participants would like to follow up? If you don't see her contact information, do follow up with me at the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. And check back at agroforestryinaction.org, agroforestryinaction.org for new information on upcoming webinars, the schedule, and to see and view recorded versions of past webinars. Thanks so much, everyone, for being with us today. Next month in October, we'll have Andrew Micolas from eCraft in Brazil talking about oil palm agroforestry. So please join us. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.